This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So this second session will try to look at what a political solution might look like in Sri Lanka. It's obviously a very broad subject, and I think it will be looked at probably philosophically than in the absolute details of how a solution might work out. I don't need to introduce Yasmin Sooka on my left, you've already heard from her, but I have Professor McGovern on my right, who's going to draw parallels with Northern Ireland. But first we'll start with Nirmala Rajasingam from the Sri Lanka Democracy Forum, who will give us her thoughts on what a potential solution in Sri Lanka might look like.
Right. I don't have a kind of a formal speech prepared because I got to know about this invitation unfortunately yesterday afternoon. But I have been working on the whole campaign of the political solution for many years, and as an activist I'd like to share my first give you very brief history and also share my thoughts with you. The first thing is the whole debate about a political solution for minority grievances. It's a very long history. It started soon after the Sinhala-only Act that was passed in 1956, and there have been various negotiations between the Tamil political parties and the successive Sri Lankan governments. And all had failed. And since in the late 1970s, a political solution for Tamil grievances has been articulated along very clear lines of Tamil nationalism. So it has been married to the whole concept of the right of self-determination of nations. So political solution. So you have a continuum. On the one extreme, you have the idea of a statehood, independent statehood, and then incrementally you move towards that kind of. And over the years, since militant Tamil nationalism took over and became became the only leadership, the debate around a political solution within Sri Lanka, a sovereign Sri Lanka, had been on for at various times muted. I mean, it wasn't completely wiped out because there were moments. For instance, there was this one moment when the 13th Amendment was introduced by the Indian government, and then subsequently, when a former Sri Lanka Freedom Party member became President Chandrika Kumar Abdullah, that was another historic moment when, very interestingly, and I think I want you to really think about this carefully because it's very key to a lot of things. She campaigned during her presidential elections positively. She was probably the first single politician to win elections, positively campaign on rights for the minorities and win with a huge majority, a bigger majority than the majority that Mahinda Rajapaksa got. And it's also interesting because what you have to see when that happened, the antecedent events, political events, when that happened, and why it happened like that. So that was a very interesting moment. Of course, she dissipated this huge mandate she got from the majority community for peace and for devolution. And before that, devolution of power was a dirty word. And IPKF and the Indian government imposed 13th Amendment was a dirty word as well. And I will tell you later on that there's only one point on which I agree with extreme Sinhala nationalists and extreme Tamil nationalists, is that the 13th Amendment is bad. Because as a democracy activist, I think it's a word of bunker policy. It was something that was imposed on us, both the Sinhalese and the Tamils, and Prabharat and Vimal Veeravansa, I have said they keep saying two of my, I don't like either of them. So anyway, and 13th Amendment is there. But anyway, apart from that, so since then, now the question now, and since then, because during the war years, this whole political process and the political debate, discussion for a political solution got completely muted and suppressed. And of course, if you are going along the logic of, Tamils are a nation, nationhood, statehood, then a political solution comes through military means, and that's what we saw, so on and so forth. And we should also look at the current claims of political solution, the current arguments. and are still couched within the whole ideology of nationalism. Not one nationalism, now 3 nationalisms. Singular Buddhist hegemonic nationalism, which has taken a very authoritarian and undemocratic visage, and then that's one. And then, of course, Tamil nationalism, which is defeated militarily, but still it's simmering because of the huge grievances that the Tamil community is undergoing. And Muslim nationalism, as a response to both these nationalisms. Both Tamil nationalism and singular nationalism have picked on the Muslims and, of course, resurgent. There's a response to this. And it is very important for us to look at the ideological edifice, this underpinning structure that supports these claims to a political solution. Because these 3 nationalisms are contested ideologies. There's these claims of nationhood, homeland, motherland, history, it's all of this. And all these claims, as you know, they are contested, they're constantly being challenged. And of course, the 13th Amendment in its original form is no longer true because the North and East, if you know, the North and East form together the traditional Tamil homelands. The Muslims will not agree with that. Somebody like me, who is an opponent of Tamil nationalism, who is opposed to Tamil nationalism. Because one of the dangers of nationalist ideologies in post-colonial societies is that their first enemies are their own people, as we saw with the Tamil Tigers. We are the first people to be targeted. Poor people, Dalits, lower caste people, women. We were the first people to be targeted by the militant Tamil nationalist leadership, right? And therefore, so we have to see why this kind of the TNA is a continuum. It was absorbed by the LDP, and they are putting forward these claims. We can also look at devolution of power in terms of a democratizing process. And one of the problems with the 13th Amendment and all other claims for devolution is we have a very authoritarian constitution. While the executive presidency, the current executive presidency is there with all its powers, 13th Amendment is useless. That's why I think 13th Amendment is not good. And so there has to be, I'm going to stop very soon because I think hopefully I'll get a chance to answer many of your questions because there's lots more to say about it during question and answer session. And one of the huge problems is that Sri Lanka has got so badly militarized and democratic governance has been dismantled. 50 years ago, Sri Lanka was like a modern ex-colonial country as far as democracy was concerned. Now it's all gone. So basically, there has to be, and there are so many points in which the Tamils and the Muslims, instead of taking refuge in nationalist ideologies and becoming ghettoized, that they should join forces with the lawyers who are protesting the impeachment of the Chief Justice, the university academics who are out on the streets marching against giving the defense budget so much money and the education budget only a tiny, less than 2%. And there are so many little communities fighting local police stations and all of that. And the thing is, one last thing I want to say is that as long as this current regime is in power, singular Buddhist hegemonic nationalism is not going to be addressed. But we have to find that wonderful formula to cause fission within that monolithic political apparatus of singular Buddhist nationalism. How do we do that? Within this, because the Sinhalese are 80% of the vote bank. So how do we do that? How do Tamils and Muslims, who are numerically small minorities, first crack this, and they have to find common points to work with this within the singular majority community, who are becoming disaffected with the government, with the current regime. And unless this government is defeated democratically at the polls, we cannot begin a whole discussion about devolution or political solution properly and develop a democratic consensus. Without that, we cannot have a political solution, either for minority grievances or for other issues. I stop there and talk about it.
Thank you very much. I'm sure your comments about Tamil nationalism will get picked up by the audience afterwards. Professor McGovern, would you like to say a few words about your experience with Northern Ireland and obviously some of the similarities and very stark differences?
Very stark differences, I think, where I'd like to start in many ways. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm sort of always very conscious that I'm not part of the selling the Northern Ireland model industry. And actually what I want to very much talk about is some of the problems that I think there are, not to say that there aren't great successes about what's happened in the North, I think there are. But what I particularly want to focus on is the issue of accountability for state violence and in particular collusion, that is to say non-state agents who've operated in combination with the state, as an aspect of transitional justice. And I suppose in that sense to reflect on that problem about where like a regime is continuing to be in power in many ways in the aftermath of a conflict where state accountability is not perhaps the top of the agenda, and where the state itself is in many ways managing and responsible for what has happened. I would sort of say as well from the outset that I'm extremely conscious of the differences here between what happened in the north of Ireland and what happened in Sri Lanka. Quite simply, the magnitude, the scale, the decimation of what happened in Sri Lanka is on a different level to anything we ever encountered. And I think that's important. No easy comparison should be drawn as a consequence of that. But in many ways, I suppose, I think it actually amplifies the very point that I want to make. That is that in a situation where in essence, the crimes that can be levelled and alleged against the state are even greater, then so much greater than the problem that the state is going to be managing and responsible for the process of investigation and holding people to account for what has taken place. I suppose any discussion about what peace process and settlement in the north of Ireland has to start with the Good Friday Agreement, and the Good Friday Agreement, of course, 1998, more or less brought an end to conflict. Was a very important and very complex document, but one of the things that was clearly absent from it from the outset was any treatment, any discussion, any real detail at all about how to deal with the past. It was one of the kind of key features of the process, and in many ways, problematic dimensions of the past were actually put to one side. Come to an agreement about the things you can agree about, get a late agreement, which often left a democratic deficit, I think, in its wake in terms of people not buying into what was actually agreed upon. And anything in which the parties involved didn't have an interest, if you like, in bringing out and exploring in any great depth. Many of the deeply contentious issues were put to one side. And dealing with the past was certainly one of those. In a sense, there was a void created. Now, in some ways, that was quite a positive void, if that's not to make just to turn a negative into a positive. That is to say that I think one of the things that came through was that there was a groundswell from a community level, from a civil society level, to step into the void that the state left in its wake, not setting up transitional justice mechanisms as, for example, happened in South Africa. It meant, for example, that community groups trying to document what had happened to them. And we've already mentioned Francis' book, and I'm going to mention it again because I think it's been an extraordinary piece of work. And it demonstrates, apart from anything else, the different forms that truth recovery takes, and that it shouldn't be left to states to simply do that. In the north, in terms of state initiatives, and that's what I particularly want to focus on, there were a number of things that have been set up, and some of them have been relatively successful. Others, I think, demonstrate the inherent problems of, as I say, providing opportunities for vested interests in institutions and in persons, continuing to be in positions of power over deciding about the ways in which accountability can be addressed. We have had, in essence, no truth commission, but we've had a range of measures that have been put into place. So, for example, we've had a number of public inquiries. The most famous is the Savile inquiry, which indeed was, in many ways, a great success. It took a very long time to arrive at its findings, published in 2011, into the killings in Bloody Sunday. And much of what was found by the Savile inquiry, as I say, was very successful. Other public inquiries, I won't go into all the details, have been more problematic, particularly I think in relation to the issue of collusion, where the issue of collusion again has been sidelined somewhat over an extended period of time. And one of the problems here is that time itself eats away, not least because a lot of people start to die off. People who were witnesses, people who can actually come forward and say something are no longer there. But also it removes the significance in the political agenda too. So we've had inquiries. We've also had a number of mechanisms which have been primarily internal to the policing institutions within the North, which have been reformed, which I think are still problematic in a number of ways. So, for example, we have had the Office of the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland. And again, there have been notable successes. The first Ombudsman in Northern Ireland, Leonean, in 2007 published a fantastic report about evidence of collusion within special branch of the RUC, the Royal Constabulary. More recently, however, the replacement to Leonean ended up having to he stepped down from his role largely because of the work of civil society groups, of human rights agencies, evidence of evidential bias, evidence of basically dealing differentially with cases where collusion was alleged or where state involvement directly in killings was alleged, that the Police Ombudsman Office was not acting in an unbiased way. And in particular, one of the key issues there was access to intelligence materials. The structures in place were such that people who had been previously members of special branch, many of them actually rehired as in the privatised world in which we live, now rehired as consultants, are actually key people in controlling the mechanisms for access to the intelligence, which is the key intelligence which would demonstrate whether or not collusion and state responsibility for extrajudicial killings has actually taken place. Those problems, as I say, existed with the Police Ombudsman's Office. They also have been evidenced, or echoed at least, with the other key mechanism, which is the Historical Inquiries Team. Now, the Historical Inquiries Team was set up in 2005. Again, it's something which has been pushed and promoted as a great model for how we should deal with things. And again, it has had its successes, and certainly some of the information that has come out from the HET and some of the satisfaction from many families about that information has not been unimportant. Basically, the HET is charged with re-looking at all of the outstanding cases, some 3,500 cases of people who were killed in the North. However, again, evidence has sort of emerged that when it comes to state killings, when it comes to allegations of collusion, even when it finds substantive information that collusion may have taken place, it doesn't make that judgment in the end, even though it's quite happy to make judgments in other ways. Or, even more worryingly perhaps, particularly in instances where British Army personnel were involved, there's a set of cases known as the Royal Military Police cases. These were cases particularly from the early 1970s, where basically the British military investigated itself then for what had taken place. Those have been reinvestigated, but the manner in which they've been reinvestigated, in particular the ways in which the interviewing of soldiers, etc., has taken place, has in essence established a difference between the way that they're treated and others, and particularly the processes that they've gone through virtually preempts the possibility, because of the way they've done things, of prosecutions coming out of it. Now, prosecutions are extraordinarily unlikely to say they're illegal, but that's no reason why you should not adhere to the proper means of acting in order to ensure the proper procedures are followed and human rights standards are followed. If we are aware and if we're conscious of these kinds of problems, and I think they're exemplified perhaps in the case of Pat Finucane, people maybe have some familiarity with the case of Pat Finucane. Pat Finucane was a human rights lawyer who was murdered by loyalist paramilitaries in 1979. A long campaign by the family and civil society and NGOs and human rights activists to try to get an inquiry into his murder. An agreement arrived at, in an international agreement in Weston Park, which said that an inquiry should be set up. Peter Corrie, a retired Canadian judge, holds an inquiry, says that collusion had happened, and recommends, according to the Weston Park Agreement, that there should be a full and complete inquiry. And here we are in 2012. Not only is there not an inquiry, but that inquiry was denied last year by Cameron, going against that international agreement and setting up instead Sir Desmond de Silva in a position where he will review what has taken place. And the problem with all of these processes is that in a situation like the North, I'm not going to draw the easy comparisons, but again, the magnitude is even greater when the crimes are even greater, as in Sri Lanka. The problem is that confidence in the rule of law in itself has always been one of the key generators of conflict. It isn't just about accountability, it's also about the transparency around accountability. Where we are now is a situation where I think we have some significant problems about the unacknowledgement of past misdeeds and the non-acknowledgement of state violence and state responsibility for collusion. And in the space that is created by that, it isn't the case that somehow the unacknowledged past goes away. What's put in the place of truth is myth and single narratives about what's taking place. There's many reasons why it is that conflict could potentially happen again in the North, is already fermented in many ways in the North, but I can guarantee you that one of them is being able to point back at a past in which the non-acknowledgement and non-recognition of state violence will play a part in the future. That has actually nothing to do with what I was going to say.
Well, it's extremely relevant to Sri Lanka because talking about a country where the majority of probably Sinhalese and certainly the government really denies what went on at all on a much bigger scale. So on that note, Yasmin, Sooka, should I just say a few words?
Yeah. When people talk about political solutions, I think what we say is that one always needs to be careful about simply taking the model from one place and transplanting things somewhere else. And the notion of a one-size-fits-all is something that really needs to be avoided. But there are three ingredients we talk about, and that is the question of political will, which is an absolute ingredient for any political solution, the notion of national ownership and legitimacy, and I think for all the reasons you speak about, the question of caste, the question of who's in and who's out, minority groups, the Muslims, and frankly on almost all sides, the question of the diaspora, the internal movement, all of those issues would need to be looked at. And then of course the question of security. If people really don't feel free and secure, either to speak or to mobilize, then I think there's a problem. And one of the things we have to look at in Sri Lanka is people who've lost loved ones are not able to mourn the dead. So in that kind of environment, where is the freedom? In terms of the normative framework in international law, many years ago, I think it was 1977, you had a French jurist who was appointed as the rapporteur by the minorities subcommission of the Human Rights Commission at the time. And he was asked to produce a set of principles called the Principles to Combat Impunity. And Louis Joynet made 2 points. The one is that at an individual right, there's an imprescriptible right to the truth. And that is to know the fate and the whereabouts of loved ones. But he went further and he said that every society has the right to the truth. And that means that a state has an obligation to, in fact, to investigate the past and to ensure that there is no revision of history. Joynet also developed 3 further principles. He talked about the right to the truth, the right to justice, the right to reparation, and I think this is something that is missing in Sri Lanka, and of course the guarantee of non-recurrence. And when he interpreted this, he talked about the restoration of civic trust. And that is about institutional reform, making sure that every citizen feels that the state and its institutions will work for them, irrespective of who they are, their sexuality, their religious beliefs, their ethnicity. All of those things should be immaterial. And I guess that's something that has to be looked at. I think in terms of the export of the South African model, there are some important lessons, and that is the inclusion of all minority groups in the discussions that took place. But what many people forget is that what preceded, in fact, the CODESA discussions, and in fact many of the negotiations, was the fact that the civil society, the churches, and the ANC in exile held what was called the Harare Declaration, in which they set out a key number of principles which were non-negotiables for sitting at the table. Yes, there were 3, what I think really major compromises during the negotiations. The first was, of course, the government of national unity. but that was necessary to ensure that minority groups felt secure. The second was, of course, the land deal, which is now coming back to haunt South Africa. And the third was the amnesty deal. But one should remember that to replace the amnesty, or rather to insert, if one can call it, in the devil's back, some morality, what was set up was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what the Commission's mandate was to investigate the conduct of both sides. Now, what many people don't know is that the Commission made findings that after 1980, the state had become a criminal state, and that in fact when it could no longer use the law, it in fact set up death squads in the country to take out anybody that it regarded as an opponent. In the case of the African National Congress, we made the finding that yes, they had fought a just war, but in the conduct of that war, in some instances, the means that they had used had crossed the line. And in fact, all of these groups, including the surrogate forces set up by the former state, with one particular ethnic group in Qatar, all three took the Commission to court to try and stop the publication of the report. But the Commission nevertheless published its report, and many years later, President Mbeki accepted the findings of the Commission and began to implement the recommendations. So it's very important for a country, for any structure that is set up, to talk about what is unpalatable, and that is to hold every side accountable. But one thing we need to be very careful about is that often the people who sit at the peace table and at the negotiations are usually the elites. And often they include the perpetrators, who are often, or the only thing they want is to secure deals for themselves. And one should remember that the South African amnesty could only work because it happened before the Rome Statute came into force. Today, that possibility doesn't exist for any country, because what we do have is a normative framework. It says that the international community has an obligation to make sure that at a domestic level, these international crimes are punished. And if they are unwilling or unable to do that, then the international community must play a role. And I would guess that when we come to the March resolution, that is something that has to be looked at. I think there are two, one of the things we should remember is that even before this government, if you look at Sri Lanka and the violence that has gone back many, many years, what you have has been state-sponsored terrorism. You've had detentions, you've had torture, you've had disappearances, you've had the tainting of the institutions that underpin governance. And right now what you have is a president who has total control of all the justice institutions. And in that context, what hope is there for governance and democracy? And this is not something we, the panelists, said. Just look at the reports of the ICJ, look at the reports of institutions in Sri Lanka, look at what all the different rapporteurs have said. What you are seeing in the final stages of the war is the chickens come home to roost. And having won the war, what you have is a sense of triumphalism. And now the state is moving to consolidate everything else under its control. I understand it with the Chief Justice. Yes, I accept, as you said, that there have been allegations that the Chief Justice's husband has been involved in some corruption. This was known well long before the Davina Guba Bill came into being. And so what the Chief Justice did is she said, this is not within the purview of your authority. And for that, she didn't see it as political. And I'm sure she must be as shocked as anybody else in Sri Lanka to see the way in which this has reverberated against her. She was only doing her job. And the question you have to ask is, you now have the panel of experts report, you have the Charles Petrie report, you have the impeachment of the Chief Justice pending, and you also have continued allegations of human rights violations in the country. And you have a government that is so bold to send those who are implicated as diplomats to other countries. They show their contempt for the world. And we have to ask is, as a human rights community that is trying after 60 years to build up a regime, should we allow that? So governance is a problem. And then I think the big question of the victims. Why don't we start with those who have nothing? The most disempowered, the most powerless. We don't have names. We don't have numbers. These are difficult things to do. And the honor we can do is to allow those people to remember. Both Francis and I spoke to many of the doctors. You know what some of them do? They taught them websites. And what they try to keep track of, is there somebody they can identify? Is there some message, some hope? So, you know, I always argue that we should talk about this, we should talk about the people who have suffered most. And I think both in the diaspora, the political parties in Sri Lanka, have they spoken to the victims? Do they actually consult with them? Do they know what people are going through and living through? It is a really horrible experience we know now. Just look at, if you talk to lawyers who are doing asylum applications, if you see what both men and women, boys and girls have been subject to sexual violence on a level that is really high, and people can't even, you know, in Tamil, there isn't a language, a word that expresses that. So people will use other words to talk about their experiences. It's not a great picture, and somehow we have to find a way to stop with it. So I would say 3 levels of political solution, the governance questions, let's deal with it.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to reinforce that last point actually, as the author of this book that's been horribly plugged. I'm embarrassed about that. But you know, we talk about accountability and it sounds a bit like box ticking or sort of being politically correct language. It sounds like, you know, jargon from the human rights community, but really what this means as part of as an underpinning of any kind of political future is individuals' lives. So, you know, the mother I met, for example, in France, who is tortured by the fact that she thinks her daughter was raped and probably killed at the end of the war. And she doesn't even think about the fact that her husband also disappeared because she's so obsessed about what happened to her very beautiful 14-year-old girl. And her other child, who is still alive and is with her, every year for the girl's birthday, buys her a present. Every year for her father's birthday, puts a shirt in the cupboard to remember him and says they're going to come back. And they can't accept the fact that the father and the sister have disappeared and will not come back. And they need closure. And they've done everything they can through IOM, ICRC, through bribing police officials in Colombo to try and get information. And this story is repeated thousands of times in Sri Lanka. And the very least we need to know is who's dead and who's alive, who's in secret detention camps, and we don't know that. So I think just to reinforce the point that accountability is actually about individuals' lives, and the kind of people that I've interviewed for my book who are survivors are really destroyed, broken people. I mean, they whispered their stories sometimes. They shook physically while telling these stories. They had nightmares as a result of meeting me, after telling their stories. They don't want to fight again. They have no desire for revenge. They just want to honour the people that died, to remember them, and to have them acknowledged, to have the truth acknowledged. So on that point, maybe we should open up now for questions from the audience. This gentleman in the front.
Yeah, I'm Richard Bourne. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Secretary of the Rampart Institute. And I've really got a question for all three, really. I should mention, because probably not many people know, but Chandrika was actually a fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies some years ago, before she was elected president in Sri Lanka. My query, I think, to Yasmin is the role of South Africa in the run-up to this charter next year, and whether South Africa can make some contribution to the political solution, which is the topic now. Obviously, a number of very distinguished persons, yourself, Nabi Pillay, South Africans have been involved at a sort of UN level, but there is an opportunity for the South African government to play some role in demanding some kind of progress in the human rights and accountability democracy field over the next 12 months. And my query to the other two is rather different. Incidentally, I hope Namar will explain, I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka, what the 13th Amendment actually said, which you've dismissed as being useless now today. But the query for those two is that as I say, I'm neither an expert on Northern Ireland nor on contemporary Sri Lanka. But from the outside, there does seem one similarity, i.e. the problem of the double minority. That in Northern Ireland, you've got the Catholic, Republican nationalist group seeing itself as a minority, but within the island of Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protestant Unionists seeing themselves as a minority. And within the southern Sri Lankan situation, you've got the Tamils and Muslims seeing themselves as a minority on the island. But if you lump together the subcontinent and Sri Lanka, the Buddhist nationalists would see themselves as a minority. And I just wonder whether you've somehow got to crack this problem of victimology if all parties are going to move forward in a democratic way for the political solution that we're looking for.
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions, so let's take that first before we take any more from the audience. And I think on the point of the start with the victimology point, because obviously many Sinhalese also say now they're a victim of international conspiracy and all that kind of thing. So, do you want to take that first?
I mean, this is a slogan used by the Rajapaksa government, and of course, absolutely scurrilous people like Vimal Veeravansa, who's this extreme Sinhala Buddhist nationalist, the GHU, the Buddhist clergy party. They are the ones who are using this. The Rajapaksa government has embraced a neoliberal development program with such great gusto, inviting China, India, anybody else, the West as well, into the country, easing off the country, and all of that. And it's just humbug, basically. It's something that's been constructed, and of course, if they can keep these people in thrall, the majority of the Sinhalese, then they can keep selling this, because after the war they kept selling this. And the other thing is, of course, we have to look at the cracks within Sinhala society to see, because people are going to become disaffected in a little while, it's going to happen. But also I must say that some of the diaspora Tamil nationalist campaigns have not been helpful either. So they have been able to use them, not that they are threatened by the diaspora Tamil nationalist campaigns at all, because that's not the point, but they use it to tell the Sinhalese, look, these Tamils are colluding with the West, and so they use them. So, of course, I don't find it. No?
Yeah, a couple of things really. I mean, I think there's two dimensions to what you were describing there. The first is the issue of double minority. And I think the Good Friday Agreement did come up through what it called the three relationships about, east to west, north to south, and within the north itself. It came up with models to deal with a number of those things. I mean, in some ways though, one of the issues was that the double minority in one sense in terms of the north-south relationship, but the south didn't really want the north at all, frankly, in any way, shape or form, so that was a pretty easy one to resolve at one level. I think the other dimension though is the issue of victimology, and I think that's quite important. It has that political dimension, but it has the more immediate one, in a sense of actual victims and whether they're acknowledged and how we write the narratives of that. And I think one of the problems there is that very often, those narratives again are kind of framed within the local context. And I think one of the important lessons, if there is lessons to be learned, about a lot of the work that a lot of the human rights NGOs and civil society organisations have, in relation, particularly again in relation to the issues of the environment, is to try to to use the international context to move away from accusations of partisanship. So that it can't fit easily then into this kind of into a victim narrative in the political sense, but it can turn into we're looking for adherence to international standards. We work at the local level, and it's that, and we will not be drawn into, if you like, that kind of partisan argument. So I think that's a quite important dimension.
Yasmin, I'd like to ask you actually, just in terms of South Africa's role in the run-up to Chogo, a bit more about the talks that the South Africans seem to be involved in with the GNA and the diaspora, and whether those talks are appropriate in this run-up to the March Geneva session, and whether the parties involved are really representative of the Sri Lankans, or particularly the victims we're talking about.
The South Africans, of course, have always been quite involved with with the LTT at some point, and then, of course, with the diaspora movement. But I think in this instance, the request for South Africa to kind of intervene has come from the government of Sri Lanka, and that has been around bringing all of the different parties together for political discussions. But I think in our engagement with the government and the deputy minister, deputy foreign minister, we have raised that there will be impetus for talks as long as the March resolution retains Sri Lanka on the agenda. And the moment, if the talks happen before the March resolution, and if that scuttles the account next year, then I think whatever leverage the international community has, it will lose it. So I think that's a real question, which the different groupings involved in the discussions need to take on board. And then, as I've said, I think that there are a range of minority groups. You have the diaspora, and this is probably the biggest displaced group in the world at home. And you have people inside the country, you have people both in the north and the east. And so the big question will be how you bring all of these different groupings together to at least work out what are some of the basic questions which need to be asked. And I think that's where the point which I made about the amendment, the whole question of devolution becomes a little bit of a problem, because as we've seen in the recently held elections, that it hasn't exactly worked out in the way that people anticipated because of the intimidation and the fact that there are other surrogates whom the government uses to deal with its own political issues. So I think there's some very big questions which the Tamils, the Muslims, and amongst them the different splinter groups, the internal, the external, they're going to need to sit down and to work it out. And the only thing I would say is that probably the example of what happened at Harare in the South African case is an important basis for any discussions, because people need to be, anything only works if you have ownership, and if it's inclusive. And if you look at the South African example, what they did really even though there were clearly two big parties at the table, the former state and the African National Congress, at the end of the day, there were many, many other parties and people sitting at the table, and it's important to hear that voice. And I think the big question is also, is there going to be a constitutional, another discussion on that, so that you begin to ensure a constitution which is acceptable to everybody. So there's a lot of, I think, prior work that needs to happen before you can have political discussion.
That issue of intrusiveness was one of the charges raised against the Norwegian mediated peace process.
Yes.
That didn't include enough stakeholders. Just to talk about the South African experience with Truth and Reconciliation and Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We understand that there have been advances through the Commonwealth from Sri Lanka, wanting technical assistance from South Africa in trying to do something similar in Sri Lanka. Do you think this is the appropriate moment to do that, or do you think it's even possible in the kind of environment of victims justice or trumpetism at the moment?
Can I just add something to Truth and Reconciliation? Correct me if I'm wrong, but Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, you drew a veil, the commission, over the admitted crimes of the apartheid government. I think you said it was a criminal. You did not pursue in any way real justice for the majority of the population. If you don't who's talking? Right?
Go ahead. Can you repeat the question?
Restorative justice.
Yeah, start again.
Over the phone, sorry.
Start again.
Yeah. I'm just wanting to since we're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, you drew a veil over what had gone before. You did not go for restorative justice in any way for the black people in South Africa. I don't know if you've identified anyone who had killed those Sharpeville and all that. And this was done in order to have peace in South Africa. The upshot was the clerk, who probably, if the ICJ was in power today, should have been tried for war crimes. He got the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, why is it that, and I'm not taking any sides, why is it there has been no suggestion that the way forward for Sri Lanka might be that promoting some kind of bringing together of all these communities, which this lady is trying to do. And, sometimes you have to draw a veil over certain things. And we accept it in the world. We've drawn a veil over Iraq. We've drawn a veil over a lot of extra international things. I just want to...
Firstly, I think that the one part of the deal was an amnesty deal. But the way in which the amnesty deal was framed in the Constitution was that they would not allow the decision of how it should be structured to be left to the negotiations. What the parties agreed was that the construction of that would be dealt with when a newly democratically elected government came into power. And what happened then was for instance, many of us in the human rights community were up in arms around that. But what we did at the instance of the First Minister of Justice, who himself was a human rights advocate, was in fact to hold people in communities about what they wanted to see. And the way in which the amnesty was framed is that it would be dealt with by this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There would be 3 structures: an amnesty committee which was made up of judges, secondly a human rights violations committee which would investigate the atrocities committed in the past, and thirdly there would be a reparations committee. All of the proceedings of the commission was public, and in fact you had to, if you had committed a crime or a violation, you yourself had to make application voluntarily, and you had to make a full disclosure, and of course there were certain criteria that had to be filled, which were designed by Professor Carl Norgard at the time. Now, if you look at the proceedings of the Amnesty Committee and the Truth Commission, what you had were all of, most of the foot soldiers applying for amnesty, but the deal always was that for those who did not apply for amnesty, prosecutions would follow. And this is where I think the huge debate in South Africa is now. Why have there been no trials? And why did people like Mr. de Klerk not apply for amnesty? Because after all, he was at the helm at a command responsibility level of crimes against humanity. I think for me that's a big issue, and many of us are in the process of putting cases together, which we are going to ask the state to deal with and prosecute many of the people who've been involved, particularly people who are involved in the death squad. So this is something that is under discussion. My critique of the South African Commission is that it focused on what I call civil and political crimes, and not the questions of the policies of apartheid. Now, if you look at the legacy of what South Africa is living with today, they relate really to the structural engineering of our society over a period of 300 years. And it affects education, it affects housing, it affects land questions, access to socioeconomic rights, water, electricity, all of that, because all of that came at a great deprivation to the black community. Now, if you look at what South Africa is grappling with now, it is a fact that some of us, and I argue that reconciliation came at the expense of redress. The fact that we never held the business community in South Africa accountable. That is why in a 20-year period, you've not seen changes in the mines. Why did we have the Marikana tragedy? It's because these are the deepest mines in the world. They manufacture artificial snow so that the miners can work under these horrible conditions. But the living conditions, the separate, all of these things have not changed. And if you compare them to, and many people say, well, Australia is more technically advanced, but South African miners get paid $18,000 a year. A miner in Australia gets paid something like $150,000 a year. So it's not surprising. And the problem with what has gone wrong in South Africa is that those who benefited from apartheid and who benefited from the transition see the Truth Commission as a moment you can draw a line to the past, when in reality you're still grappling with those issues. But I take comfort from the fact that, look at what has happened in Chile and Argentina. 20 years down the line, prosecutions have begun. And I think what you're going to see is that this kind of impunity will begin to be replaced. So, I don't, personally, as somebody who's right there, I don't believe in deals. And I've been involved in many countries where there have been amnesty, deals and suggestions, and I always say, for people at a lower level, it's people who just follow orders blindly, I think there's room for an amnesty. But for those who hold command responsibility or the political responsibility, there should be no deals. And I don't believe, and I mean, many colleagues in the region will tell you that impunity breeds a new kind of impunity. So we must be very careful of that.
Sri Lanka?
For Sri Lanka, I believe that command responsibility is an important issue, and I don't think you can draw the line. And the world needs, we are facing, I think, a turning point in the international community. If you look at Rwanda, you look at Srebrenica, we say never again. And yet in this decade, under our watch, you've had possibly 150,000 people die. If the reports are accurate, maybe even more. And the question is, why is this allowed to happen? What about the international obligation to protect civilians? Something's gone wrong. So I think we really need to I agree with you that there's a need to bring people to the table, but it cannot be dealt with at the expense of impunity. And in any country, I mean, if we look at the example, for instance, in Kenya, post-election violence, you have the International Criminal Court involved, but more than that, you had a vetting and secure screening of the judiciary. Judges have had to show good cause why they should remain in the judiciary. Now there are interviews happening for the post of police commissioner, and the country is going through a vetting and screening process. While they've had a truth commission, they are looking at a whole range of other issues as well. And so we cannot build a country on the edifice of impunity. I don't believe it can.
What do you want to say a few words quickly?
Very, very quickly. Yeah, it was just in response to that idea about drawing the veil. I think the analogy is wrong in the sense that who's drawing the veil and over what is it being drawn. If we have a situation where perpetrators are drawing the veil, that's the problem. I think we all are in the business, ultimately, surely, of at least drawing the veil might be the wrong way of describing it. We'll get to a point where people say, well, there we now know what the past was, and we now build a different future on the basis of knowing about that. And if that is drawing a line, drawing a veil, whatever analogy you want to use, I think that's what it is. But that can't happen in a situation where the person basically, the victims have to draw the veil, the perpetrators have.
Because I realize we haven't taken any questions.
Oh, sorry, just about accountability and truth and reconciliation. Without people being given the opportunity to tell what happened to them, I don't think real reconciliation can happen. The only thing is, I think the international community has seen the last stages of the war, the May 2009 war and how it all ended. But it was a 30-year war, and thousands of people died throughout the war. And what is also very interesting is that in the late 80s, nearly 40 to 50,000 Sinhalese were wiped out by the state within a period of 2.5 years. In the worst massacres possible, because the JVP, which was sort of left-wing, pseudo left-wing Sinhala nationalist party, rose up and there was an insurrection and the state put them down against the 13th Amendment. It's a very complicated picture. But those people also have to have the opportunity, because as I said in another meeting, all those things have got deeply sedimented into Sinhala society. So when they feel, this is another victim thing, that nobody talks about what happened to the Sinhalese during the war. And when the Tamils have hugely powerful or clear powerful diaspora lobbying going on, they say, see, nobody cares about us. It is very important for everybody who lost to come to the ground and be able to say that.
I think that illustrates very nicely the cost of impunity.
Cost, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's quickly take a round of questions and then end, because trying to think who haven't asked questions before. Do you want to go ahead? And then the gentleman with red hair, back.
Again, it's Matt from British Forum. Yasmin, about this South Africa facilitating or giving this window of opportunity for talks. Who exactly is representing the diaspora?
Okay, that's it. Thank you. And I'll just take a round at this point. The gentleman at the back hasn't asked a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I also had a question for Yasmin. Whether you're concerned in your official capacity or in your personal capacity about the deportations of Tamils to Sri Lanka from Commonwealth states, namely Britain and Australia, and if these deportations are having a detrimental effect on the quest for truth, justice, accountability, and by extension a political solution.
Quite a very topical question. Somebody hasn't asked the question yet. David.
Just wanted to bring you back, if I could, to the prior to the session. What could a political solution in Sri Lanka look like? There's a huge amount of discussion about international pressure, international standards, and so on. But how is the political solution going to be created in Sri Lanka? Who are going to be the interlocutors now that Tamil Tiger is no longer there? I mean, it's interesting to get the panel's reflections on these kind of questions.
Okay, we're already over time, so I'm going to just take those questions and stick with them, and you're going to have to ask any other questions privately at the end. Yasmin, there are quite a lot for you. Do you want to start with the South African facilitation? Who's representing the diaspora?
I have no idea, and I think I would have to ask the South African government who's there. I just know that the TNA is one party. I do think in terms of the deportation, that's a shame. And I think there are very active lawyers who are beginning to look at these questions. But I mean, we're seeing people have to be killed and tortured, and that's a problem. And I think Tamils and Muslims and minority groups in the cinema need to say what the political system is.
Do you want to talk about that?
I will say this to, I've said this to single and national audiences, that there's nothing sacred about Constitution. The only thing that's sacred to me is human life and their well-being. We can change it like we change a code. In Sri Lanka, in the last so many years, constitutions have seen come and gone and amendments have been made. Why do we not have a devolved constitution and get rid of the executive presidency? That is absolutely paramount. And even if, personally from my personal point of view, even if we don't have revolution, if we get rid of the executive presidency, immediately things are going to lift off. And then we can talk again, because this is an incremental, this can be a phased process. It doesn't have to happen all in one day, and there is a neat fixed solution. It is also about political bartering between the communities. And unfortunately, the TNA, and good luck to South African government, the TNA and the SNMC are completely, totally bankrupt political parties. They are such ghettoized thinking, except that the SNMC will join the government, not join the government, they will do this kind of task. Because they have built themselves on getting their votes out of, using the nationalist card. That's all they are capable of. They are not able to imagine beyond that. And when one or two people start thinking imaginatively, the diaspora Tamil nationalists will start shouting and saying, oh, you have to talk about the Tamil independent state, that's all. You can't talk about, anything, the 13th Amendment. So it's one, they have to start getting their act together. This is the sad thing. And we have a very weak opposition. So I am saying everything can happen after we get rid of this current regime. I am so sad to say that we are not going to get them out in the near future. They are going to have a long life because the opposition is very weak. There's nothing. And it's going to take a very long time. But we have to start working from now. We have a lot of work.
Hold on a minute, just 1 minute. Just to answer David's question, then it seems like her answer is regime change. It's probably not very helpful.
Through the democratic process, we have done that many times. In Sri Lanka, we have done that many times.
Okay, I realised we had actually a bit more time because we're a longer session this one, so we'll take another round of questions. Gentleman with the white shirt.
Actually, to start with,
No, sorry, the gentleman behind you I pointed to, you can go afterwards.
I'm Jim Foster from the University of Essex. I was wondering, you mentioned South Africa's experience and a relationship with LGBT. What role do you think the international community has to play in Sri Lanka's political solution as maybe intimate with their own individual relationships, and as nations, as that means. And also, as you're talking about the inquiry, Professor McGovern, in Northern Ireland, do you think that there is room or time in Sri Lanka for such an inquiry to come through if there are human rights violations still occurring?
Right, this gentleman.
Thank you. Class for giving me an opportunity. Nirmala spoke very well about the history of Sri Lanka from 1950 onwards, but famously, even before the award of independence, there was a telegram from leader of the Tamil Congress, Telugu Island, not to give independence. They wanted 50-50 actually at that time. All the Tamils at the time. But now, my question is that we have to look at the past, as you said. We have to look at the plantation economy, how Sinhalese people were slaughtered and confined to, unproductive land and employment. And there is a vast backdrop of where there's been conflict in Sri Lanka that is prevalent in Sinhalese society as well. If you look at the professional groups, they are largely, almost 50% Tamils and Sinhalese. So that lot of friendships, west borders occupied by Tamils in Colombo and so on. So it's a vibrant economy. So don't think of Sri Lanka as a backward economy.
What's the question?
Very popular government as well. In any election, it's bound to win even today. One has to accept it, although there are so many funding problems, as you say, and it's corruption.
No democracy.
I don't argue about corruption, but it is a democracy.
This is not a dialogue. Is there a question here?
I said that how can you say it's a non-democratic government when it wins elections?
Okay.
That's my question.
All right, that's a question. Thank you. Anybody else? This gentleman at the flat back.
Thanks. Just quickly, could it be that the UN actually has to invent a new mechanism that doesn't even exist up till now? Whereas, as Mr. Sooka said earlier, that the Tamil population is the largest displaced population in history of the world. You did say that. In view of that, is there a mechanism that's needed that represents the opinion of the diaspora when we're limited to the member states and we're talking about, the UN is a function on member states and the opinion of the member states, and the diaspora doesn't have a national state.
So how does the diaspora's voice?
So how does the diaspora's voice get represented?
All right, that's pretty good. We've got at least 4 questions there. I think maybe we should start with Northern Ireland and the role of the Crown.
First of all, don't call me Professor McGovern, makes me feel very uncomfortable. Mark, thank you very much. I think the thing is the political, as in the North, as everywhere, political context is going to dictate the feasibility of any process. It's not the process itself, it's the political context that will determine it. And in terms of inquiries, it strikes me anyway, and I don't know, I'm very conscious of not knowing not on the ground about Sri Lanka, but the politics are such that you basically got, what would it be, if you're inquiring into the particular aspects of state crime in Sri Lanka today, then it'd be the state that's likely to be the people inquiring into it. That's a problem. The courts won't be able to do it. And we have a weak echo of that. Is kind of what I'm saying. How much more problematic is that where we're looking at now? In that context, if we were thinking of something like Savile, we're in a different space as far as that's concerned. And where we are is where the families and the NGOs were before the political settlement. In other words, working for years, documenting, lobbying, bringing in international voices, identifying with the international community, emphasising international standards. That's, the work of documentation is probably where things are, it seems to me anyway, as much as anything else. Can I just say one little thing in terms of, you saying about kind of winning elections? The problem is majoritarianism, again, is a problem. Certainly in terms of Northern Ireland, majoritarianism is what caused the conflict. Certainly, it was one of the causes, to the conflict. And one of the reasons, the only way of getting around that is actually to not have majoritarianism. Simply because you're the majority does not mean that you have every right to act in any way that you wish. And that's the basic fundamental problem about understanding democratic processes and democratic values.
Yeah, I mean, I have not forgotten the question, but
Well, how do you put to non-democratic elections?
yeah, I mean, yeah, because I mean, we have my group, we have been talking about majoritarianism, singular Buddhist majoritarianism for the last 6-7 years endlessly, because basically what has also happened is after the war, Mahindra Rajapaksa won these elections with an amazing, with quite a big majority, without the help of the Tamils and Muslims. And so now he feels, and he has capitalized on that. And basically they now believe that the singular Buddhism, the singular community is sufficient for them. And so they keep feeding them with this kind of, singular Buddhist nationalist propaganda to keep that vote back, a kind of a monolithic base for them. So this is and with that they feel, with that kind of support, unquestioning support along those lines, then they feel that they can do anything else, like play around with the judiciary, constitutional amendments, the journalists' disappearances. I met women in the East, people who were not involved in the May 2009 war, young women, 18, 19-year-old women, whose husbands had been abducted after the end of the war. And these were girls who were married off by their parents when they were 16, 15, 16, because they wanted to stop them from being recruited by the LTTE. And then their husbands get abducted. And one of them had to sell some ration she had got, dal, to come and see me because she didn't have money for bus fare. I mean, this is, the kinds of abductions that are going on still in the hinterlands that nobody knows about for all kinds of reasons. And it's just, sometimes there isn't even a direct, it could be a corrupt policeman there who simply, wants to have his way with the woman and then, get rid of the husband or whatever. So it's just the level of impunity is horrendous. And so truth and reconciliation, yes, but we have to first stop what's going on there and somehow think of the people who are there and get them out of the bad situation. That's why I don't have much sympathy with some of the diaspora campaigns, which are totally out of touch with reality of what is happening in Sri Lanka.
Well, that leads us quite nicely to the other question from a gentleman who was asking about how to represent diaspora opinion, or maybe whether you should represent it. Oh, God. No, not you. Pointed at Yasmin.
I think across the world, there have been many conflicts where we've had quite a large diaspora sitting outside. And of course, I think for young people, the real question about whether they are interested, it's a remote question, but it's usually around their parents and an older generation. But what you have found is that if you're not going to recognize the plurality and diversity of voices out there, you're not going to have a political solution. And in this case, you have a diaspora that is, the amount of people who are in Toronto, people in London, Norway, Switzerland. I think there's a whole generation who does want to go back. And so one would have to find a way for their voices to be heard. But ultimately, any solution is going to have to include both Senator and the people who live in the north and the east. Because, one of the things we said in our report is that there's a real need for a reality check. For those people who advocate for Tamil Eelam, I think there's a question about, is that a realistic option? Or do you have to deal with the fact that you've had a very successful victory, which has wiped out the LTTE? And what that means is that the people who are going to inhabit this island need to find a way of living together. And that's going to require a whole set of preconditions. The problem with most conflicts now it's what we call identity conflicts. And it's not like we have battles where people march back to another country. This is not the Second World War or conflicts like that. The conflicts today are mostly where people occupy almost the same space. And so that means there has to be an obligation to find a solution and a way of people living together. And what that format is going to be, I think they're very clever constitutional lawyers who are able to work that out. But it does mean that there has to be a lot of work with all of the different groups. And, there will not be regime change. I think that's the reality. We have a president who's won with an incredibly popular majority. But what there is also is, and this is something, in South Africa, when people came to the Truth Commission, when the victims started speaking, so white people in my country said, well, they're exaggerating. These things didn't happen. And then, of course, when the perpetrators themselves appeared before the commission, and they began to talk about the atrocities and the violations they had been involved in the death squads, and just in the kind of thing that most people said, we didn't know. But you have to ask the question, what is the price of living without wanting to acknowledge the benefit and why it's possible? And so there's a huge question for people who live very comfortably to ask, at what price is this coming? Because at some point, it will begin to affect you. And you just have to look at how many journalists have had to leave or have had disappeared. People talk about the white vans, they're still happening. There are people who nobody has seen. I mean, if there are people who are separated, who should be put on trial, they can have access to a lawyer and put them on trial. But nobody has heard from them. And let's really look at these rehabilitation questions. This is not about political solutions. This is about good governance. And there's a big question. I mean, the Davina Guma bill is really about corruption. At the end of the day, that's what it's about. And people are going to have to start asking these questions. I mean, you cannot have one family controlling everything in a country. That's a recipe for disaster. So, yes, I think everybody needs to be in the talks, particularly minority groups, and one has to work out how their rights are protected. But the question is, how do you acknowledge plurality and diversity? And I think a question for the diaspora is, how are you going to deal with the things that separate you on caste lines? And all those things are huge factors.
Thank you. Let's take another round of questions. I noticed Yolanda was very back, who had her hand up for a very long time. We'll start with you. I think you should come forward a bit. It's quite hard to hear you back there.
My question is specifically about whether recent attacks on the judiciary should be a trigger mechanism for the Commonwealth Advisory Group to take concrete steps in Sri Lanka, because it's very hard to talk about a political solution or governance in a context where the sort of independence of the institutions has been stripped away, and politicisation involved in the recent impeachment process, which has been raised by the Special Rapporteur on the Defence and Judiciary, strikes me as a trigger mechanism potentially.
Okay, thank you very much. Yolanda Foster from Amnesty didn't introduce herself, but that's okay. There's a gentleman at the back.
Yeah, please talk.
One question, please, and can you speak loudly? I can't hear you.
Western governments have usually supported Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government, and as far as supplying arms and whatnot, and with the Tamil nationalist liberation struggle, whatever you want to call it, they're naturally anti-imperialist in their nature. So do you think it's naive for Tamil diaspora to actually appeal to these governments and think they can actually, help us with find a political solution? And one other question is, do you think...
No, one question. Can we have one, please? Otherwise there's lots of people. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yes, you can hand up.
Look, can I just say, I advocate great caution to this body in getting involved in the domestic internal affairs of Sri Lanka in relation to the judiciary for this reason. Look at what happened what happened with Pakistan and the Chief Justice.
Can we have a question, and can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Tanimai Varganam. I'm a lawyer, and I studied the Pakistan and the Kenyan case where there were interventions in relation to the judicial function. And when we look at Pakistan today, there was a huge lawyers' campaign And in fact, I followed that case in Pakistan with great interest. And then we heard from the lawyers in Pakistan that actually what they ended up with was a worse situation to what they had under Musharraf. So really, the change has to come holistically from the countries involved, not from pressure and powerful organisations prodding and pushing. It's got to be from the people on the ground who know the reality. Otherwise, an artificial situation is arrived at, which does nobody any benefit.
Thank you.
I would ask you to look very carefully at what happened in Pakistan, and to the judiciary and the rule of law in Pakistan, and also Kenya, which had almost a similar thing but not quite. And Sri Lanka now seems to be the next in line for that kind of destabilisation.
Okay, can I just make a quick mention? Both the Sri Lankan Bar Association, so that's the domestic professional society of lawyers on the ground, and today the civil rights movement, which has a long distinguished history in the country, have issued statements of concern about the current attacks on the judiciary. So there are very strong domestic concerns on this.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. I think, William, you had a question.
Yes, a quick question for both Professor McGovern and Sooka. I think there's one common element between the Sri Lankan and Northern Ireland insurgencies, which haven't been mentioned, which is the ability of communities outside the country to raise funds. A huge sum of money raised among the Tamil diaspora for the LTT over the years. A lot of money raised in America for the IRA over the years. Do you think that this is something in which there could, post-conflict, be some transparency to help meet the kind of transparency deficit that you, Professor McGovern, identified?
You mean transparency retrospectively?
Where did this money come from, and who has it now?
Okay, do you want to respond to quickly and then we'll go on to the issue? The big one.
I think you read the note. Arms manufacturers I totally agree with you. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have a process whereby all aspects of anyone who's involved and anyone who's engaged in the conflict should be answerable, should be held accountable to it. I think that's precisely the sort of thing that, for example, was being recommended by the consultative group on the past. They made a recommendation in 2009 for setting up a legacy committee. There was a wide range of issues that they were looking to try to bring on board. They wanted an international commissioner to oversee it. That was the recommendation. It got ditched as soon as it got to Parliament.
Do you want to address just the gentleman's question at the back before we get on to the judiciary, the issue of is it realistic to expect Western governments to support a liberation struggle like this?
Can I just quickly, just the two quick questions. The first, the gentleman at the back. I don't think they are naive. I think politically, the Tamil nationalist movement has always been right-wing, contrary to popular belief in the West. It's always had a right-wing, particularly the diaspora community. So they do like a top-down approach. Why can't Britain or the US go and just bomb Colombo and get us Tamil? And this is the kind of questions we hear all the time. Within the community, these kinds of approaches. I wouldn't go to the full spectrum of their arguments, but anyway, that's where. So it's not about naivety. They want something like this done. That's one thing. The second thing is about the funds. Is that yes, huge amounts of funds were gathered and collected, and it's not just funds. It's also the LTT proxies ran businesses which churned out vast amounts of profit. So the day LTT ceased to exist, we don't know what happened to the money, and people disappeared with the money. Some monies are probably deposited with organizations that are continuing that kind of work, Tamil nationalist work. I haven't seen sort of diaspora, so-called liberation groups or whatever have the kind of posh facilities that the Tamil nationalist lobbies have, the kinds of offices, etc., etc. Somebody like me will not be able to get an audience with one of these Tamil nationalist groups, because I will, as soon as I meet them, the first question, uncomfortable question I will ask is, where is the money? So because of that, they don't meet with people like us. They don't like to talk with people like us.
Right, so, I mean, even the Tamils who donated, they want a bit of accountability.
A lot of Tamils donated, who are in debt, who mortgage their houses and leave money, want to ask questions.
You want to make a quick point?
Just on the anti-imperialism point, I just think it's, you know, if you are anti-imperialist, and I would regard myself as someone who's anti-imperialist, it doesn't necessarily advance your cause if you don't lobby and push and press and campaign and find opportunities for wherever you can find them in order to advance what it is you're trying to put forward.
Right, let's tackle the issue of the judiciary and whether the Commonwealth Advisory Group should enter into these waters.
Yeah, I think it's important that the Commonwealth and the International Commission of Jurists fix this question out, because I think all states respond to international pressure and the pressure of their peers. And contrary to, I think, your view on Kenya, if you look at the way in which Commonwealth judges from many African countries are assisting Kenya through the process of bringing people in their judiciary. So I would say that I think it's a very important issue. And certainly if you talk to people in the Bar Association and to many groups in Sri Lanka working on the ground on this issue of issue statements, I think many of them would welcome the interest from the rapporteur and certainly from the Commonwealth. And I mean, you just take a country like South Africa or a country like Sierra Leone. Imagine if you didn't have Sunny Rampal and the Eminent Persons Group, and you didn't have the pressure on South Africa, if you didn't have apartheid declared a crime against humanity in the General Assembly, if you didn't have that kind of pressure, I think what you would find is that we would probably still be living under apartheid. So the efforts of international solidarity groups and of course the role played by these bodies is a very important one. And from the perspective of the Sri Lankan government, I mean, it's a very important symbolic moment when people do attend Chava. And that's why one raises the question of, should a punitive measure be to step back, to postpone, not to give it to them? And if you do go there, what's the kind of message that you send? I think these are important moments, because at the end of the day, all states respond to the pressure by peers, unless they completely rogue states, and then of course there usually are other sanctions. So I think it's absolutely important that the Commonwealth raises these questions, because when you start to interfere with the judiciary, you begin to see problems around the rule of law. And I think that's a really big issue.
Also, I think Pakistan is very different from Sri Lanka.
All right, let's not start on Pakistan at the very end. Thank you very much. Ending on that note, ending on the looking forward to the Commonwealth, there's a government meeting, probably time to call for lunch. Thank you.